We don't have time for this. Reyes. Sergeant Dalton's voice cut through the rising wind like shrapnel. Dust lifted from the scorched rubble as Private Reyes knelt beside the German shepherd, tugging at the leash with trembling fingers. The dog, Echo, wasn't listening. His ears were stiff, nose glued to the dirt. Something had caught his scent, something small. Forgotten. Echo dug harder. This is a live combat zone, not a damn playground. Dalton snapped, already halfway down the collapsed corridor of the bombed-out hospital. His boots crunched over shattered tiles, bloodied gauze, broken for stands. We sweep, we clear, we move. But Reyes didn't move. Neither did Echo. The dog whined, once low, guttural, then scraped deeper into the blackened earth, his nails grinding over bone, brick, and something softer. Reyes leaned closer, afraid of what he might see. He expected shrapnel, maybe, an arm, a child's torn shoe. But instead, there it was, a plastic pacifier, dirt-caked, cracked on one edge, faded stars still visible on the front. Echo nosed it gently, then sat down, tail still, eyes locked on Reyes with an expression that didn't match war. It looked like grief. Reyes froze. He didn't speak, didn't even breathe. All around him, the silence of the building felt wrong. Not tactical silence, emotional silence, the kind that pressed on your chest, the kind that made your rifle feel like a mistake. He reached down and picked up the pacifier. It was warm. Dalton's boots stomped back around the corner. I said move, but then he saw it. He saw the pacifier in Reyes's hand, and something in his face, something sharp, old and heavy, cracked without sound. He didn't speak this time, just looked around the remains of the pediatric ward. They were standing in a place they hadn't realized they'd stepped into. No one had. Reyes rose slowly. There was a baby here. Dalton didn't respond. Behind them, more soldiers entered the room. One by one, the men of Fireteam Echo paused. Guns dropped a little lower. No one made jokes. No one moved. Forward. Echo, the dog, stood and walked softly to a pile of dust-streaked blankets against the far wall. He circled once, sat again. Wind, that same low sound of kneading. Someone to understand. Reyes followed, and there it was. A shallow dip in the floor, small, lined with worn cloth. A red toy car buried halfway in the debris. Dried milk crusted on the edge of a fractured bottle. Someone had hidden a crib here. No bodies. No sounds, no survivors. Just traces. Dalton stepped back. He ran a hand over his face, the same hand that, weeks ago, had pulled a boy from a burning Humvee without blinking. But here, in this silent hollow of loss, he couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Reyes gently placed the pacifier back in the spot Echo had found it, as if returning something sacred. Neither did Reyes. Then, faintly, impossibly, Echo's ears lifted. He turned his head, out beyond the hole in the hospital wall, beyond the dust clouds and the echoes of war. A single cry floated on the wind. It wasn't animal. It wasn't ghost. It was a baby. Alive, and every soldier in that unit froze. Guns forgotten. Protocol ignored. Time suspended, and not one of them said a word. They simply followed the dog. The men didn't speak. No orders, no hand signals, no barked corrections. Just the dog Echo walking forward through the breach in the hospital wall. Every step a silent question. Behind him a dozen soldiers followed, their weapons lowered, not out of safety but shame. The war outside hadn't stopped, but for these few seconds it didn't matter. Somewhere beyond the smoke and silence, a sound none of them dared to believe had shattered the rules of reality. Reyes was the first to reach the edge. He scanned the ruined street, his boots crunching over glass and shell casings, heart pounding in a way he hadn't felt since his first firefight. But this wasn't adrenaline. It was something far older, deeper, the sensation of walking towards something sacred. A baby's cry in a war zone didn't make sense. Not here, not now, not after what they'd seen. And yet, they had all heard it. Echo darted ahead, nose skimming the ground. He turned sharply toward a collapsed section of road where the earth had buckled under bombing weeks ago. Reyes followed, slipping down the broken slope, his boots catching against rebar and scattered bricks. The air smelled of rot and rust, old smoke, and something else, faint, human. He stumbled forward, and then he saw it. A fissure in the pavement, narrow and jagged, like a throat torn open. Echo stood above it, tail rigid, growling low and steady, not with threat, but warning. Reyes crouched, the hole lead into the underbelly of what had once been a basement garage, now buried and blackened. He couldn't see anything. But then a second sound, faint, fragile, a whimper, no cry this time, just breath. Reyes's throat tightened. "Sergeant," he called, barely above a whisper. "There's someone down there." Dalton slid down behind him, the others forming a loose perimeter around the hole. Nobody asked questions, nobody doubted. Not anymore. They moved fast, but careful. Shovels, knives, hands, even helmet edges scraped away layers of debris, brick, and metal. Minutes passed like hours. Each breath they took stirred dust that smelled like memories no one wanted. And all the while, Echo stayed poised, ears flicking, nose twitching, body alert, as if guarding not just a life, but a secret. Finally, a narrow crawl space opened enough for Reyes to slip through. He went down headfirst, heart in his throat. His flashlight beam trembled as it hit the dark. A room emerged, half collapsed, part of a crumbling sub-basement, the remnants of what once was a shelter, or maybe someone's last hope. The air was thin, stale, still then a shape. Huddled in the corner, shielded by a rusted water tank and a makeshift wall of mattresses, was a woman, young, eyes wide, hands trembling, and in her arms, impossibly, heartbreakingly real, a baby. Reyes froze. The woman didn't scream, didn't flinch. Her eyes darted past the flashlight's glare, locking onto Echo, who had crawled in behind Reyes. She didn't speak English, but the look on her face wasn't fear, it was surrender, as if she had been holding on for this exact moment and no further. Reyes lowered the light. He didn't need it anymore. The glow in her eyes, the breath in the infant's chest, the tears she didn't try to wipe away, they lit up the space more powerfully than any beam. Gently, carefully, he reached out, and she gave the baby to him. The infant was warm, alive, so small it barely weighed anything at all, but it was everything. Reyes clutched the child to his chest like he was holding a second heartbeat. Behind him, the woman tried to stand, her legs buckling. Dalton slid in, catching her with surprising tenderness. No orders now, no barking, just quiet hands, doing quiet things. They carried the woman and child up into the light, where the rest of the unit waited, silent and stunned. The woman collapsed into the arms of a medic. The baby whimpered once, a soft, bird-like sound, and then rested. Nobody moved. No one knew what to say. And then Echo did something none of them had seen before. He sat beside the child, lowered his head, and gently licked the baby's hand once, softly as if giving a promise. Reyes didn't realize he was crying until Dalton placed a hand on his shoulder. The sergeant didn't speak. He just nodded once. Not approval, not pride. Something deeper. Something shared. Later they would learn her name was Halima. That she had fled the bombing 3 weeks ago. That she had lived in that basement without food, with only melted snow and a rusted tin can. That the father had died shielding them during the first blast. That the pacifier Echo had found had belonged to the baby's twin who hadn't survived the cold. But in that moment, none of them knew any of that. They just knew something had cracked open in all of them. Something war had tried to bury. A baby had cried. A dog had listened. And the world, just for a breath, had remembered how to be human again for the rest of that evening. The war seemed to shrink away from the corners of their minds. The air still trembled with distant shelling. Radios still crackled with coded chatter, but in the small perimeter around the hospital ruins, silence returned, not the tactical kind, but the sacred kind. Fireteam Echo had seen 1,000 missions, swept 100 buildings, cleared alleyways dripping with horror, but never this. Never life, fragile and deliberate. Blooming through rubble, they set up a makeshift camp behind the remnants of a supply truck, where the walls still held firm and the smoke didn't seep in. Halima lay wrapped in 2 layers of military blankets, eyes fluttering with exhaustion but never fully closing. The baby Leela, they now knew, slept in Reyes's arms for nearly an hour before waking with a startled gasp and a cry so delicate it made 2 men turned their faces away to hide the sudden tightness in their throats. No one slept. Not really. Dalton stood guard a few paces away, staring out toward the scorched horizon, his face unreadable. His reputation had been built on calculation, speed, and ruthless precision. But tonight, something in him had shifted. Not softened, something else. As if the muscle that kept him alive in war had finally remembered what peace felt like, or worse, what it cost. Around midnight, as the wind picked up and the power flickered inside their backup comm station, Reyes noticed Halima watching him. Her lips moved without sound. Then again, he leaned in, confused. She gestured to her bag, torn, filthy, almost missed in the debris. Reyes handed it over. She opened it with trembling fingers and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. At first he thought it might be food, but then the fabric unfurled, and inside was a folded photograph, creased and worn. The kind that gets kissed before sleep. The kind people keep hidden in boots and Bibles. Reyes took it gently, held it under. The moonlight dot it showed a man in uniform, not theirs. He was young, maybe in his 20s, with strong eyes and a child slung over one arm. Leela, unmistakably, a few months younger, fuller cheeks, eyes wide with something like wonder. Halima pointed to the man's face, then to her chest. "My husband," she whispered in accented English. Reyes nodded slowly, his throat dry. She pointed again, this time not to herself but toward the other side of the picture, and that's when Reyes saw it. A badge, partially hidden but unmistakable. It was an old NATO patch. Reyes blinked, turned the photo slightly. Dalton saw the movement, and came over one glance, and the color drained from his face. Reyes turned to him. "You recognize him?" Dalton didn't speak. He just stared, jaw clenched, and then quietly, with a weight that he seemed to drag the night down around them, he said, "His name was Lieutenant Farid Rafiq. We trained together. Kabul, 2014. Reyes looked back at the photo. Then, "Why is she here? Why are they still?" Dalton's voice dropped to a whisper. "He defected, disappeared with intel no one could trace. High Command called it betrayal. Said he'd vanished into civilian life. They closed the file, told us to forget his name." Reyes stared at him. "And you believed that?" "I didn't want to." Halima reached out again, not to take the photo back, but to place her hand gently over Dalton's. Her fingers were cold, still shaking, but her eyes, deep dark, unwavering, held something that stopped both men in place. She pulled a second photo from her bag. This one was newer, grimmer, the same man, but this time, dead blood on his uniform, a child's pacifier in his hand, Echo lying beside him. Reyes felt his breath catch. Dalton swore softly. Halima didn't need to explain. The truth, like dust, settled into the space between them. For hadn't defected. He had tried to get his family out, had stayed behind to cover their escape, had died alone, buying them just enough time to vanish into the broken skeleton of the city. Echo had stayed with the body, guarding it, mourning it, refusing to leave until a unit finally found him weeks later, half-starved near Ferro. Reyes stared at the dog, who now lay curled beside Layla once again, ears twitching in his sleep. He wasn't just any canine, Dalton said quietly. He was Ferid's. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, too full, of memories, regret, of orders given by men who never touched the dirt, who never heard the last gunshot in a father's chest. Dalton sat back, elbows on his knees. He saved them both. Echo stayed. Reyes couldn't speak. He just stared at the picture, at the crumpled story between blood and shadow and memory. In the distance, flares lit up the horizon. Enemy movement, too far to matter. Tonight, Dalton stood slowly. Tomorrow, he said, we'd get her out. Reyes looked up. To where? Anywhere but here. I don't care if I have to walk her to the next border myself. No one else buries this family. The next morning they packed before sunrise, wordlessly, efficiently. There were no jokes, no plans to debrief, just quiet coordination, the kind that only came from men who had stopped following protocol and started following truth. And Echo, tail up, head high, led them out, not like a soldier, but like a son, walking his family home. By dawn, they were moving. There was no briefing, no command structure anymore, just movement. Halima carried Layla beneath layers of scavenged cloth, her footsteps uneven but steady. Echo stayed near, ears flicking with every gust of wind. His gait had changed, not as a scout, not as a trained canine, but as if he knew exactly what was at stake, knowing who he was walking beside. Reyes walked slightly ahead, scanning the horizon for signs of movement, while Dalton trailed close behind, head down, one hand permanently resting near his sidearm, but not from threat. From responsibility they took no roads. The convoy had split into two. Fireteam Echo moved as shadows, avoiding the grid, staying inside the ruins where maps meant nothing and survival was measured in meters. They moved through what used to be neighborhoods now stripped to their bones. Burned cars sat half submerged in sand. Swing sets with no swings, dull limbs buried in mud. No sound except the wind, the scrape of boots, and the quiet whimper of a baby who hadn't known a world without hunger. At noon, they reached what was supposed to be the last checkpoint, a battered UN outpost abandoned weeks ago. The roof had collapsed. The radio tower was twisted metal. No flags, no guards, just a single wall of sandbags and a rusted sign written in 3 languages. Beyond it, an open valley, and then the mountain jagged and silent. Dalton stood motionless, eyes scanning the terrain. This valley's a dead zone, he muttered. Used to be clear, now it's mined. Reyes turned. Any safe path? Dalton shook his head, not officially. Halima didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She pulled Leela closer. The baby whimpered, then went still again. Her eyes weren't fully open anymore. Her skin had begun to pale under the thin scarf wrapped around her face. Reyes clenched his jaw. We don't have time. Dalton stared at the valley for a long moment, then slowly knelt beside Echo. The dog sat, waiting. Dalton reached into his vest, pulled out a crumpled strip of cloth torn from Farid's old uniform, something recovered weeks ago from a bag they'd never catalogued. He tied it loosely around Echo's neck. The dog didn't flinch. Find a way, Dalton whispered. One last time. Echo stood. He sniffed the wind, then stepped forward, carefully, one paw at a time, into the valley that had swallowed dozens before. Every man watched, breath held. 30 feet in, the dog paused, turned his head, then kept walking, veering slightly left, toward a crumbling stone wall half buried in earth. Reyes didn't wait. He followed. So did Halima. Dalton signaled the others a single nod. No words. They moved slow, methodical, like dancers on broken glass, every step echoing with the weight of someone else's footsteps. The wind picked up again, and with it came the bitter scent of old fire. They walked for 20 minutes, sometimes in single file, sometimes frozen in place when Echo stopped to sniff, ears twitching, muscles tense. Halfway across, a sound cracked through the air, distant, metallic. Gunfire. Behind them. Dalton spun. Go, he barked. Don't stop. Reyes grabbed Halima's hand, steadying her. Echo broke into a trot now, faster, more urgent, glancing back only once. Bullets whined in the distance, warning shots, maybe, or something worse. Either way, they didn't turn back. They reached the edge of the valley as the sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows against the rocks. Ahead was the mouth of a narrow pass, invisible from satellite imagery. A path long forgotten except by locals and Perhaps one soldier who never forgot his homeland's fractures. The group funneled through. No mines here, no noise. Just breath. When they cleared the pass, the world changed. The land dropped into a steep slope of pine and frost, dotted with distant huts and smoke trails from wood fires. A forgotten village near the border, one that didn't show up on any digital map but existed in whispers and stories. Safe enough, quiet enough. Farid's last gift. They collapsed in silence. Dalton helped Halima sit. Reyes unwrapped the cloth around Leela, checking her breath, her pulse, faint, still alive, but barely. They carried her to the nearest cabin where an old man opened the door without question, nodded once, and let them inside. That night, none of them spoke much. The fire crackled. Halima slept sitting upright, Leela in her arms. Echo lay across the doorway like a stone guardian, UNMOVING. Dalton sat in the corner, elbows on knees, face dark in the flicker of flame. Reyes came and sat beside him. She's not going to survive this war, Dalton said quietly. Reyes shook his head. None of us are, not really. They sat in silence a while. Then Dalton said, after this, I'm done. Reyes turned to him. Dalton looked tired. Not from running, not from weight, from remembering. I've carried too many ghosts. Farid deserved better. That girl deserves better. So I'll walk her out of this war if I have to, even if no one follows. Reyes said nothing. Then Echo stood. Straight up. No noise, ears pricked. Outside, the wind had stopped, but footsteps approached. Not many, just one. They all froze. Then came a knock too. Short raps and everything they thought they knew about endings, about safety, survival, and the cruelty of war was about to change. The knock was soft, almost too soft to notice beneath the crackle of fire and the rustle of wind sliding through the eaves. Yet every man in that cabin turned toward it at once, as if the air itself had shifted. Echo stood frozen in the doorway, body stiff, ears locked forward, not an alarm, but recognition. Something ancient flickered behind his eyes, something more instinct than training. Dalton rose first, slow but certain, his hand hovering near his sidearm out of habit more than fear. Reyes followed silently, pulse hammering in his throat. The knock came again. 2 raps, no urgency, no voice. He opened the door. Outside stood a man, civilian coat, military boots, face weather-worn, a rifle slung casually across his back, though his hands remained open, palms visible. He wasn't armed for battle. He was armed for truth. Behind him 2 others waited, locals, possibly border scouts, but it was the man in front who mattered. His eyes went immediately to Halima, now standing inside the room, still half asleep, Leila in her arms, pale and breathing. He stepped forward. Halima let out a sound, something between a gasp and a cry, and collapsed into him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist as if afraid she might fall through him. He held her without speaking. His face didn't crumple, didn't weep. He simply stood there, breathing her in. Reyes watched, unable to move. That's not possible, he whispered. That man Farid is dead. Dalton stepped beside him, jaw tight. It's not Farid. But it was. Not the way they remembered him, clean-shaven, precise, smiling in old NATO uniforms. This version bore scars, a thicker beard, and the silence of someone who had disappeared on purpose. His face had changed, but his presence hadn't, and neither had Echo's response. The dog moved forward without hesitation, sat at his feet, and pressed his head into the man's leg with a sigh that sounded like homecoming. No one spoke for a long time. When Halima finally pulled back, her hand trembled as she touched his face, her words flowing fast and sharp in a language none of the soldiers spoke, but they understood the emotion in every syllable. It was apology, explanation, disbelief, and prayer all in one. Farid took the baby carefully from her arms. His hands didn't shake. Later, after they had eaten, after the fire had burned low, Farid explained, he had never died. The photograph, bloody, folded, stamped as final, had been real, but misinterpreted. The man they buried with Echo at his side had been another soldier, wearing his jacket, covering Halima's escape. Farid had returned hours later and found Echo alone, wounded, refusing to leave the body. He'd tried to follow, but the trail had already vanished into the chaos. NATO declared him dead. So he became dead, and from death, he worked for 2 years. Farid had lived in the seams of the conflict, moving across borders, extracting civilians, guiding orphaned children, ferrying food where UN trucks wouldn't go. He couldn't speak, couldn't signal. One word out of place and he'd endanger everyone he was trying to save. But he'd stayed, always one step behind hope, always praying one day Halima and Leela would find him again. Now they had. Dalton sat in silence, his hands folded, no orders, no reaction, just eyes dark with something even he couldn't name. Reyes finally found the words. We were told you were a traitor. Farid smiled faintly, not with bitterness but fatigue. The truth is only dangerous when it threatens someone's comfort. I didn't want revenge, I just wanted them safe. Reyes looked at Leila asleep in his arms. Now, she hadn't cried once since she'd been returned, as if even at her age, she knew the war had changed, or at least, her war had. They didn't leave the cabin that night. By morning, Farid had made arrangements. A route had already been opened through the eastern mountains. A convoy of doctors and relief volunteers was waiting in a safe zone 3 hours away. He'd walk Halima and Leela there himself. He offered Echo back to Dalton, expecting the dog to follow command, but Echo didn't move. He stayed by Farid's side, head low, tail still. Dalton crouched and rested a hand on the dog's back. "He's yours, he always was." Farid nodded, emotion rising in the silence between them. When they parted, there were no grand goodbyes, no cinematic farewells. Just shared glances between men who had seen too much and spoken too little. Reyes watched as Farid adjusted Leela's sling, checked Halima's coat, and stepped into the wind with Echo at his heel. The figures grew smaller, slowly absorbed by the landscape, until only their footprints remained. Later, in the afteryear, Reyes would try to explain the moment to others, how a pacifier in the dirt had unraveled a lie, led to a truth, and rebuilt a family no bullet could destroy. How a dog, once trained for war, had remembered what loyalty looked like in its purest form, but he'd always fail. Words couldn't hold it because some stories don't end with closure. They echo, and in a quiet part of a broken world, a soldier, a mother, a child, and a dog walked toward peace, unnoticed by history, uncelebrated by politics, but never forgotten by those who stood still long enough to witness it.